Here's Johnny.
Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and murderous dads. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at The Shining. This classic 1980 psychological horror follows Jack Torrance, an aspiring writer and recovering alcoholic who accepts a position as the off-season caretaker of the isolated Overlook Hotel in the Colorado Rockies, being joined by his wife Wendy and young son who suffers from disturbing visions, Danny. After a winter storm leaves the Torrances snowbound, Jack's sanity begins to deteriorate due to the supernatural forces that inhabit the hotel, as there are quite a few spirits hoping the Torrances will stay at the Overlook forever and ever and ever. The Shining was of course directed by the one and only Stanley Kubrick. Quite possibly the most consistent director of all time, Kubrick is responsible for a variety of classics like Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Barry Lyndon, Full Metal Jacket, and Eyes Wide Shut. The Shining is up there as one of Kubrick's very best, and it's also widely considered one of the greatest horror movies of all time. After Barry Lyndon turned out to be less monetarily successful as Kubrick hoped, he decided to take a stab at some more commercially popular material. Apparently he just locked himself in an office with all of the existing Stephen King novels, and after a couple of rejects he found himself glued to The Shining. But it also may have been the only option available, as King wrote The Shining in 1977, making it only his third book following Carrie and Salem's Lot, both of which had already been turned into successful films. I won't be going into the book's details here, as the film covers a lot of the same and a lot of different ground, but as with any King novel, it was extremely long and a lot of changes had to be made so it wouldn't be 12 hours long. Kubrick actually rejected a screenplay written by King himself, believing it was too straightforward of an adaptation, and opted to write it himself. He co-wrote this new version with Diane Johnson, a novelist and professor of Gothic fiction. I don't know much about her work, but based on several quotes, she seemed to think very little of King's writing. Kubrick was much more excited about the source material though, and he truly believed it could make a really great film. A lot of actors were considered for the role of Jack Torrance, but despite a lot of back and forth with King, Kubrick put his foot down and demanded Jack Nicholson take the role. Nicholson had been only increasing in talent and stardom at the time, recently starring in The Last Detail, Chinatown, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Kubrick knew he was one of the few men who could bring such an extreme intensity to the finale. The role of Wendy went to Shelley Duvall from Brewster McCloud, Nashville, and Three Women. She and Kubrick had a notoriously complicated relationship with each other on set, but more on that in a bit. Over 5,000 boys were interviewed for the role of Danny, which eventually went to 5-year-old Danny Lloyd. This is pretty much his only film role, although he did have a cameo in Dr. Sleep. Kubrick was very protective over Danny on set, and the boy didn't even know he was shooting a horror movie. This was in great contrast to the way he treated Duvall and Nicholson, who were often yelled at and isolated to keep them in their deteriorating headspace. He was especially meticulous when it came to Duvall's scenes, making her shoot the iconic baseball bat scene a whopping 127 times to get it the way he wanted it. The Timberland Lodge and ski resort in Oregon was used as the facade for the Overlook Hotel, with the hedge maze and interior shots being created on studio sets. The cinematography was handled by John Alcott, a frequent Kubrick collaborator who also shot 2001, A Clockwork Orange, and Barry Lyndon. Just like the actors, he had to endure the meticulous nature of Stanley Kubrick. The Shining was among the first few films to use the Steadicam, and its inventor Garrett Brown worked directly with Kubrick and Alcott to refine and alter the system for the film's many innovative shots. The score was composed by Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind, and music editor Gordon Stainforth matched the songs to their respective scenes. The Shining had a very limited release to start, but quickly got a wider one, and ultimately brought in $47 million at the box office. It was actually met with mixed to negative reviews upon release. Critics agreed the performances and technical components were very well done, but some felt the supernatural components were too arbitrary, the characters were too unlikable, and the slow pace included no thrilling moments. It also deviates greatly from King's novel, so a lot were displeased that it wasn't a straightforward adaptation. The Shining was one of very few Kubrick films to not receive a BAFTA or Oscar nomination, and it was even nominated for 2 Razzie Awards. It took some time, but The Shining was ultimately reappraised, and it's now considered one of the most important horror films of all time. It may just be the most researched horror film of all time as well. There are so many different theories and interpretations related to every meticulous detail that Kubrick put into the film. We'll discuss some of those details once we get through the breakdown, but for now it's probably time we get started. How'd you like some ice cream, Doc? 'Cause we're watching The Shining. The movie opens with some gorgeous aerial shots of the Colorado landscapes, also giving us a taste of the film's unnerving score. The Yellow Beetle is being driven by Jack Torrance on his way to the Overlook Hotel, where he is meeting with manager Stuart Ullman for a meeting about his new position as the hotel's winter caretaker. We jump over to the Torrances' apartment in Boulder, where we meet Wendy and their son Danny. He's a weird little dude, with his closest pal being an imaginary friend named Tony.
I don't want to call them Mrs. Torrance.
Speaking through Danny's finger, Tony expresses concern over moving into the hotel, but he won't share why. Jack meets with Ullman and the current caretaker, Bill Watson, to discuss his responsibilities as the caretaker. Jack was a teacher before he quit to pursue writing fiction full-time, and he's excited to have the months of November through March to focus on a new story. The hotel is closed during these months due to its isolated location, as maintaining the snow-covered roads would simply be too expensive. Jack's role as the winter caretaker is essentially damage control, meaning he'll keep the hotel warm by running the boiler and addressing any weather-related issues that occur. Ullman asks how he and his family will deal with the isolation of living here alone, sharing that in 1970 a winter caretaker named Charles Grady snapped under the conditions. He ultimately murdered his wife and twin daughters with an axe, placed their corpses in a room, and shot himself with a shotgun. Jack is not in the least bit fazed by this nightmare story, and he assures Ullman that both he and Wendy would love it here. Tony tells Danny that his father has gotten the job, and Danny begs the finger to share why he doesn't want to live in the Overlook. The boy suddenly has a vision of a blood-filled elevator, the previously mentioned Grady twins, and himself screaming. This led to Danny passing out and Wendy calling a doctor, although he doesn't share what Tony told him. He describes Tony as a little boy that lives in his mouth, but he refuses to say much more. The doctor chalks this up to an unexplainable childhood episode that probably won't happen again. Good work, Doc. Wendy does share that Tony has been in Danny's life since he was in nursery school, where he had a tough time adjusting before an injury caused him to be homeschooled. Turns out Danny's shoulder was dislocated by Jack in a drunken accident. The silver lining is this event caused Jack to quit drinking though, and he is now 5 months sober. The Torrances are making their journey to the Overlook, and we quickly learn that Jack is sarcastic and short-tempered with his family. The hotel is closing up shop as they get a tour from Ullman, which includes the beautiful Colorado Lounge and its authentic Native American stained glass. Meanwhile, Danny is making friends with the local dead girls. They tour their new living quarters, which includes 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a bathroom. Next, we check out this fucking ridiculous hedge maze that definitely won't be important later. Oh, also the Overlook was built over a Native American burial ground, but don't worry about that. Then we have the gold ballroom and bar, but luckily the alcohol has been cleared out. We get the pleasure of meeting head chef Dick Halloran, who is tasked with showing Wendy and Danny the gigantic kitchen. Here's the walk-in freezer that definitely won't be important. Halloran refers to Danny as Doc, which Wendy points out is a nickname they call him but haven't said at the hotel, but Dick just plays it off as a lucky guess. But as he tells Wendy about the dry goods, Halloran reveals to Danny he's a bit of a telepath.
How'd you like some ice cream, Doc?
Wendy joins the fellas in the boiler room, which allows Dick to explain his powers to Danny. Growing up with his grandmother, Dick could speak to her without either of them opening their mouths. She called this ability they shared the Shining. Danny also has the Shine, but he shares that Tony has told him to never talk about his abilities. Tony shares info with Danny by putting him into a sort of sleep and showing him visions, and Dick asks if he's ever told Danny about the Overlook. Danny can't quite recall, but he asks Dick if he's afraid of the hotel. He says no, but does share that the hotel has a bit of the Shine itself. He says that when bad things happen somewhere, those events can leave a trace of themselves at that location. People who shine can see those traces just like they can see things that haven't happened yet. Lots of things have happened at the Overlook and not all of them were good. Danny asks what happened in room 237, but Halloran tells him to stay out of there. And then we jump a month into the Torrance's stay, and Jack is already neglecting his caretaking duties, his writing duties, and his good husband duties. He tells Wendy he feels so at home in the Overlook, it's almost as though it's a place he's already intimately familiar with, as though he's been here before. Okay, that's rather disrespectful, but looks pretty fun. Wendy and Danny explore the giant hedge maze, in which they seem tiny as Jack looks over a tabletop version of it. We jump to Tuesday as Wendy learns of an incoming snowstorm and Danny tries to suss out room 237. Wendy interrupts Jack's writing in the Colorado lounge, which sets him off on an angry rant about her breaking his artistic concentration. He tells her to stay the fuck away whenever he's in here, and this is only the beginning of Daddy Torrance's downward spiral. On Thursday, Wendy plays with Danny in the snow, and despite the windows maybe being covered in drifts, Jack is inside appreciating something very bright. On Saturday, Wendy calls the forest ranger via radio, who informs her the phone lines are down and will probably stay that way until spring. Uh-oh. Meanwhile, Danny is finally making some headway with the local girls.
Come and play with us, Danny, forever and ever and ever.
Now we jump to Monday as Danny watches this seemingly wireless TV, and despite Wendy's concern, he goes to the living quarters to retrieve his fire engine while Jack is asleep. Oh, so it looks like Jackie Boy has not been sleeping at all. But at least he likes the hotel.
I wish we could stay here forever, ever, ever.
Danny asks if he'd ever hurt him or Mom, and Jack asks him if his mother put an idea like that into his head. He tells his son he loves him and would do anything for him. On Wednesday, Danny's playtime is interrupted by Jack's tennis ball, which of course came from room 237. Wendy finds Jack screaming in his sleep, and he says he had a horrifying nightmare about killing her and Danny. He chopped him up real good. This debacle is interrupted by Danny, whose sweater is torn and neck is bruised. Wendy believes Jack is responsible and runs off with her son, and angry-ass Jack meanders his way over to the bar. Good thing ghost bartender Lloyd has restocked the shelves. He provides Jack with a bottle of bourbon despite his lack of funds, and it seems Jack has known Lloyd for some time now. Jack happily jumps off the wagon and he begins complaining about Wendy. He claims he never laid a hand on Danny here, but Wendy has never let him forget about the drunken accident. Speaking of, Wendy rushes in with the news that there is apparently a crazy woman in the hotel who strangled Danny. Jack is completely unfazed by this revelation, and he reluctantly agrees to check the room. Meanwhile, Halloran gets word of the increasingly bad Colorado weather from his Florida home. This is followed by both he and Danny just about convulsing while Jack checks room 237. Lo and behold, there is in fact a naked lady chilling in the tub. As any reasonable man would, Jack kisses her. Ah shit, tub lady is looking a bit moldy. Danny continues shaking and Jack backs out as the woman laughs. Of course he tells Wendy there was nothing at all, and he proposes that Danny may have given himself the bruises. He hypothesizes that Danny had another episode and hurt himself, and the little fella has visions of the word red rum. Wendy wants to leave the Overlook, and this sends Jack on another tirade about how she always finds a way to interfere with his opportunities at success. Dick calls up the forest ranger after failing to reach the Overlook, and the ranger agrees to call up the Torrances via radio. Jack finds the Gold Room hosting quite the soiree, and Lloyd stocks him up with more bourbon on the house. Jack would like to know who exactly is buying his drinks, but Lloyd assures him it's of no concern. A waiter spills drinks on Jack and escorts him to the restroom to clean him up, and this fucker happens to be named Delbert Grady. Jack recalls that Grady was the caretaker who hacked up his wife and daughters before committing suicide, but Grady points out that Jack is the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, and he always has been. Grady also vulgarly shares that Danny is attempting to reach Dick Halloran for help, using his great abilities against Jack and the hotel. Grady goes so far to say that Danny has been naughty, and suggests that he and Wendy have a stern talking to. He shares that his own daughters hated the Overlook as well, one even attempting to burn the hotel down. Delbert had to correct them, as he puts it, along with his wife when she tried to interfere. Wendy is talking herself into leaving with Danny and the snowcat, but Tony shares with her that Danny is asleep now.
Danny's gone away, Mrs. Torrance.
Jack removes the batteries from the radio to prevent any more interference, and the ranger shares with Dick that he wasn't able to reach the Torrances. This absolute king hops right on a plane to check on his little shiner the next morning. He calls up a buddy at a nearby auto shop who sets him up with a snowcat to traverse the snowy, isolated roads. Wendy leaves Tony to talk with Jack, arming herself with a bat to be safe. She doesn't find him in the Colorado lounge, but she does find his very riveting story. God, I wonder how many poor production assistants had to type those damn things out. Jack finds Wendy snooping in his masterpiece and asks her what she wants, and she shakingly says that she just wants to talk. Jack thinks that's a great idea, as he was hoping to talk with her about Danny. Tony is listening in as Jack asks what should be done with the boy.
I think you have some very definite ideas about what should be done with Danny, and I'd like to know what they are.
He berates the poor woman and mocks her concern for Danny, arguing that she doesn't respect his contractual agreement to care for the Overlook Hotel. Wendy tells him to stay back, but Jack promises he isn't going to hurt her.
I'm just gonna bash your brains in.
Wendy eventually conks Jack with the bat and sends him tumbling down the staircase, and she drags his drooly ass into the freezer. This is one of those good old freezers with little safety in mind, so it luckily locks from the outside. Jack tries several methods to get released, but Wendy refuses. She tells Jack that she and Danny are leaving via the snowcat, but she will come back with a doctor once her son is safe. Jack gleefully tells her she isn't leaving, and sure enough, both the radio and snowcat have been incapacitated. A few hours pass when Jack hears a knock at the door, which turns out to be Delbert Grady. He is very disappointed in Jack's poor performance in correcting his family, and he's now doubtful he has what it takes. Jack assures him that he will get the job done, and Delbert unlocks the freezer. Meanwhile, Dick is almost at the Overlook. Go, Dick, go! Tony is yammering about red rum and even writing it on the door, which Wendy awakes to see in a reflection as Tony screams. Jack begins chopping the bedroom door down with an axe, and the two flee to the bathroom as Danny wakes back up. Wendy fits Danny through the window but struggles to squeeze herself through, and she tells her son to hide as Jack begins breaking into the bathroom. She slashes his hand as he tries to unlock the door, and the sound of Halloran arriving sends Jack away. Danny finds a cupboard to hide in as Jack makes his way downstairs, following the sound of Dick's calls. The poor chef gets ambushed by Jack quickly and thoroughly, which Danny seems to have seen through his shine. Jack hears his scream and rushes to the kitchen, spotting him flee from his hiding spot. He follows Danny outside and into the hedge maze, following his footprints in the snow. Now even Wendy's getting in on the ghost action, with some kinky ghosts no less. Next she finds dead Halloran, this undead partygoer, and a whole bunch of well-dressed skeletons. Jack is still chasing Danny, but the little genius has the bright idea to reverse his steps, hopping backward into his previous tracks. Wendy gets the grand unveiling of the blood elevator, and Danny's trick successfully leaves Jack at a loss of where to go. The crazed father picks a path and wanders into the maze, and Danny follows his tracks back to the entrance. Wendy reaches Dick's snowcat just as Danny escapes, and Jack quickly begins succumbing to the cold. She starts up the snowcat as Jack screams his heart out, and the maniac eventually freezes to death in the maze. The movie ends back inside the Overlook, where a zoom in on a photo confirms that Jack has always been the hotel's caretaker. And that's The Shining. I mean, yeah, this is a really cool film. This is Kubrick at his most meticulous. There are just so many bizarre little details to appreciate. And the best part is they aren't even logical details. Every little thing in The Shining is designed to make the viewer feel lost, disoriented, and unsettled. The intense music and sound design, the literally impossible layout of the hotel, and the absolutely off-the-wall performances by everyone involved combine to make such a fascinating and unique atmosphere. The story has so much mystery and tension, and it never relies on gore or jump scares to frighten the audience. The ghosts are enigmatic and leave us asking so many questions, as do all of the themes the film explores. The Shining touches on masculinity, sexism, racism, alcoholism, corporate America, manifest destiny, domestic violence, and so many complex issues in ways that are captivating but don't beat you over the head. There is seriously so much to discuss, I couldn't possibly cover it all, so I'm just gonna ramble a bit about some of my favorite observations, appreciations, and theories. And there's already a near endless amount of resources for people who want to dig deeper into The Shining, a lot of them being right here on YouTube already. I also recommend Room 237, a feature-length documentary dedicated to analyzing all of the theories, secret messages, and intricate details that The Shining is known for. It ranges from ideas around the Holocaust to Kubrick faking the moon landing. There's some really interesting and wild stuff in there. Jack Torrance is a nasty bastard and one of the few examples of a truly unlikable protagonist done really well. From the start, there is never a moment of warmth or love from Jack. His family is little more than an inconvenience. Similarly to his rant about taking care of the hotel, Jack simply feels contractually obligated to care for his family, despite his displeasure and incompetence at doing so. He isn't straightforwardly possessed and forced to do evil. The evil acts the Overlook wanted him to commit were already bubbling at the surface due to his resentment. Jack feels a constant push and pull between his familial obligations and his work duties, ultimately deciding that the latter is more important. There's also a big tug of war between freedom and predestination in the film, with it ultimately being really unclear whether or not Jack was doomed from the start. The photo of the 1921 4th of July seems to imply Jack has always been a part of the hotel, but even if that's the case, it's hard to pin down what that means. The 1970s caretaker was named Charles Grady, while the 1920s butler was named Delbert Grady. Are they blood relatives? Are they the same guy reincarnated? Just a bizarre coincidence? Just vessels for the same entity that overtook Jack? All of the above? Who the hell really knows? A big point of discussion I've seen between fans is how willing Jack was to hurt his family before coming to the Overlook, with a pretty popular theory being that Jack sexually assaulted Danny in the film. The basic argument is that Jack assaults Danny after what is called the fatherly love scene, possibly doing much more than strangling him. The tub lady did not hurt Danny, Jack did. Jack's encounter with her was not a real event, but a repressed version in which Jack is the woman and Danny is his father. Danny telegraphed this version of events to Halloran as the real events were just too much for him to comprehend. The idea around sexual abuse is brought in from the tub lady being naked and the dog bear man giving head at the end, as an early scene of Danny shows him with a stuffed bear. I think there's some merit to this theory, but I don't fully back it. I do think Jack strangled Danny, and Danny basically gave Halloran a repressed version of the story, but I don't necessarily believe there was any pedophilia or rape involved. I don't knock anyone who does believe it, but it's just not something I look for in a film if it's not very readily present. But a lot of people have also taken this theory a step further, saying Jack has done it before and possibly a lot of times, and that Tony is totally just a way for him to cope with his trauma. Depressing stuff. Others argue that before the Overlook, Jack would have never intentionally harmed his family, citing his possibly honest remorse for the accident that dislocated Danny's shoulder. Jack's first scene at the bar with Lloyd is a big shift in his own control, as he was literally willing to sell his soul for some alcohol. Before the bar scene, Jack had a nightmare about killing his family, at which point the idea of harming them is still horrific to him. It isn't until after this scene he encounters the tub lady, later lying about his experience to Wendy and essentially forsaking them. So some see this as evidence that deep down Jack did love his family and he had to be somewhat coerced into harming them. Jack had to give himself up to the forces of evil through the temptations of alcohol and sex before he could willingly be turned to harm his family. I'd say most people agree on this next point, but the film is even pretty ambiguous on whether or not the ghosts are real. Just about every scene where Jack sees or talks with a ghost involves a mirror or other reflective surface, which has been argued to symbolize the ghosts simply being manifestations of Jack's darkest thoughts. Jack isn't talking to malevolent dead people, he's just talking with himself as he descends into an awful case of cabin fever. This idea gets a lot more iffy when you consider Grady opening the freezer for Jack. That's really the point where the ghosts prove they are real and able to physically do things. Plus, Wendy and Danny have their own ghostly experiences, a couple of which they have in common. So I really appreciate all of the crazy fan theories and interpretations, but at the end of the day, I do consider this a haunted house movie. I personally think all of the ghosts are real and work as a unit for the hotel, and their general intention is to absorb the souls of anybody they can. Dick said that awful events can leave a trace of themselves, so the many tragic and horrific events that took place within or on the grounds of the hotel began to accumulate into a single force, hoping to feed itself with more misery. People who shine like Halloran, Danny, and maybe Jack can more easily perceive this force, which the hotel uses to drive them mad. Dick grew up learning how to utilize and control his power, plus he always worked at the hotel during its busy season, so the ghosts weren't able to affect him in the same way. He described the ghosts as pictures in a book, unable to do any actual harm, so it seems he was unaware of their true power. On top of that, the ghosts may have purposefully hidden just how present they were, similar to how they hid from Wendy until their final assault. The ghosts didn't just haunt for fun, they had a specific agenda to cause death. If we take Dr. Sleep into account, the Overlook specifically wants to absorb people's shine. Neither Danny nor Jack had any real understanding of their abilities, so they were much more ideal candidates to absorb than Dick. It does make me wonder if all of the Overlook ghosts also had the shining in life. What do y'all think? There are a ton of films, some of which are Stephen King adaptations, that utilize Native American burial grounds and generic curses in really exploitative ways, but The Shining utilizes those components in a more nuanced way than usual. The murder of Native American people surrounds the Overlook, with the building buried over corpses and the halls decorated with probably stolen art. Jack speaks of the white man's burden in reference to controlling Wendy and Danny, with the larger meaning of that phrase being the European colonizers believing they had to impose their civilization on the inhabitants of their colonies and prospective land. A lot of critics have found The Shining to be an analogy for the Native Americans' brutal massacre under the guise of manifest destiny and the expansion of the quote-unquote civilized world. It may just be their blood that fills the elevators. But even at a much more individual scale, The Shining is about a man who needs to feel like he is the one in control, like he is the one with the power over those he considers weaker or lesser than him. But what I ultimately love so much about The Shining is its ability to be interpreted in so many different ways. Even if you only pick up on half the themes, discrete visuals, and historical references, that's still way more than the average film gives a viewer to digest. It is a treasure trove of bizarre intricacy that never feels dull in its 2.5-hour run. All in all, The Shining is one of the greatest horror films of all time. It has fantastic performances, an iconic set, and a mysterious story that will keep you satisfied and guessing no matter how many times you rewatch it. And through all of that, it still manages to be super scary. I seriously end up enjoying it more with every watch, and it is perfect for a cold, snowy day. Well, that's about it. I could have talked about this movie for a lot longer, but y'all probably need to get back to your days. Y'all should be very excited to know I'm starting a new franchise next. Maybe tune in this Friday to find out what it is. Thank you all for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of The Shining. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support this channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks, y'all.